I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase, I've come to the end of my rope. It's something you express when you feel like you're just kind of stuck, when you've exhausted all the options and you're just not sure where to go from here. Maybe you've expressed that phrase in dealing with a difficult person. If you're a parent, maybe it's with your kids, or maybe it was a situation that you just couldn't seem to overcome no matter how hard you tried. I can remember being at the end of my rope early one morning my junior year of college. And for some reason, unknown to me, I don't remember, but I had gotten into this habit of waiting to the last minute to write research papers for a professor who was notorious for being a difficult grader. And the previous projects had gone well, like really well, so I figured that I must be on to something. So I spent all night before the due date trying to write this major research paper in one sitting. And no matter how hard I tried, nothing just seemed to come. I can remember at one point, like early in the morning, just beginning to type, I hate this, like over and over again on the screen. I walked around campus in the middle of the night pleading with the Lord for all kind of inspiration, but nothing came. And needless to say, I didn't get a good grade on that paper, and I quickly changed my writing strategy for the rest of that semester. When you have nowhere to go, when you kind of reach the end of your abilities or resources, you've reached the end of your rope. And what you may not be familiar with, I know this was new to me, is there's this quote that sort of ties into that from Franklin D. Roosevelt during his presidential campaign in 1932. He said this, when you come to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. And I think that's pretty good advice. And we're continuing in a series called Breakthrough, looking at stories in Scripture that can speak into our areas of what we're calling stuckness, right? The reality is we all face areas where we need breakthrough, where we maybe are just simply tying a knot and hanging on because we're at the end of our rope. And as we've gone throughout this series, we've been looking at what we're calling this breakthrough U-curve. It describes a journey that we often go on, seeing God break through our areas of stuckness, whether big or small. And on this breakthrough U-curve, there are a number of milestones in the journey. This first is that holy discontent. It's where this journey starts. It's a dissatisfaction, right, with the status quo. And that leads us to that untested faith as that line of progress begins to move upward. It's that unbridled passion of a potential breakthrough. Like I know the problem and I know the solution. And yet what often we find is we come to this place of crucified hope where that progress begins to dip because the reality is our answers aren't quick fixes to the areas of stuckness in our life. It's where the rubber of our faith truly meets the road. And as we go and the progress seems to slip, we often reach this point of a crisis of faith. It's the bottom of that progress in that U-curve where we become vulnerable to despair and increasingly tempted to give up. It's this pivotal moment where are we going to give up? Or are we going to continue to press through and shift from expectations to expectancy in God? And if we do, and over time, what Scripture shows us in different stories is that there's a revived hope. It comes. It's where you haven't yet seen the fulfillment of God's promises, but you still find this fresh expectancy in who God is. And finally, at some point, there is that breakthrough faith where that progress moves to the top. It's that stage where an answer has finally broken through, even though it may not look like where you originally started back at that holy discontent. And listen, this is by no means a formula for how God works in every circumstance, but rather it just kind of gives us language for finding our point on the journey to breakthrough. Maybe we're in a place of holy discontent, right? We see areas where we desire change. Or maybe you're at that lowest point, maybe a crisis of faith where you've sort of reached the end of your rope. And Lord willing, I know there are probably stories of seeing God bring you all the way through to breakthrough, to bring you through the areas of stuckness in your life. So today we're going to dig into the story of a king in the Old Testament and see how God broke through in a major crisis of faith. We're going to hone in on that lowest point, that crisis of faith. It's a great example of someone who was at the end of the rope. If I could sum up the message today in a big idea, it would be this. In a crisis of faith, choose to hope in the Lord. In a crisis of faith, choose to hope in the Lord. As I just mentioned, we're going to be looking at the story of one king in Scripture who faced a serious crisis of faith. And when I had the chance to visit Israel in 2019, among the many memorable moments, one experience I'll never forget was getting to walk through Hezekiah's tunnel. It's a man-made tunnel through the bedrock under Jerusalem that brought fresh water from the Gihon spring outside of the city walls to a pool inside. And when you walk through that tunnel today, there still is water flowing. It's kind of creepy. You're walking through this like dark tunnel through water up to your ankles, and at places it's tight for someone who's 6'2" and weighs what I weigh. And did I mention it's pitch black without your phone flashlight? Like, what would compel the people of Judah and Jerusalem to construct such a engineering marvel? Well, it was the threat of an invading army. So let's read some of Hezekiah, who this tunnel is attributed to, some of his story, and see how it connects to our theme of breakthrough. Okay, we'll start reading in the Old Testament book of 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 1. Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, began to rule over Judah in the 3rd year of King Hoshea's reign in Israel. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah. He did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight, just as his ancestor David had done. So Hezekiah was the king of the southern kingdom of Judah beginning around 716 BC. And many years before him, there was a split in the nation of Israel between the northern kingdom of Israel and then the southern kingdom of Judah, where Hezekiah was now becoming king. And what is remarkable about Hezekiah is that he did what was pleasing to the Lord. And before you ask, like, weren't these God's people? Shouldn't all the kings be seeking to please the Lord? Right? You'd think that. But quickly after King David, the greatest and most influential king and Hezekiah's ancestor, it's largely sort of been this string of leaders who turned the people away from God and toward the many gods, quote unquote, of the surrounding nations. So Hezekiah stands out as someone who chose to honor God, just like his ancestor David did. But where did that desire come from? If we look at his family tree, other than David being that distant ancestor, his father Ahaz was not one of those good kings. In fact, a few chapters before this, in 2 Kings chapter 16, verses 2 to 4, we kind of get this quick bio on King Ahaz. It says, Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. He did not do what was pleasing in the sight of the Lord his God, as his ancestor David had done. Instead, he followed the example of the kings of Israel, even sacrificing his own son in the fire. In this way, he followed the detestable practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burned incense at the pagan shrines and on the hills and under every green tree. So listen, this guy Ahaz was not a good dude, and he actually did some pretty detestable things that we just read, and that's who Hezekiah is growing up around. This is the culture of leadership that he's stepping into. So we don't know a lot about the influence in Hezekiah's life. We know about his mother, Abijah, who was the daughter of the high priest Zechariah, and it's possible that maybe she had an influence on his faith in the Lord. But all that we can say is that God chose to work in and through Hezekiah. And all that to say, okay, God can work in your life in spite of your past or your upbringing. I think that's an important thing to know. Now, you may not have been raised in a Christian home. Maybe you didn't grow up in the church. And listen, it's okay. God can use your life to bring about reformation, to transform the landscape of your family. Right? So Hezekiah, he becomes king after his father has led the nation of Judah to worship every kind of God except the Lord. Right? Pagan shrines, like literally under every green tree. So what might God begin to stir in Hezekiah? Okay, let's pick up reading in 2 Kings 18, verse 4. He, meaning Hezekiah, removed the pagan shrines. He smashed the sacred pillars and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke up the bronze serpent that Moses had made because the people of Israel had been offering sacrifices to it. The bronze serpent was called Nehushtan. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before or after his time. He remained faithful to the Lord in everything, and he carefully obeyed all the commands the Lord had given Moses. So the Lord was with him, and Hezekiah was successful in everything he did. He revolted against the king of Assyria and refused to pay him tribute. He also conquered the Philistines as far distant as Gaza and its territory, from their smallest outpost to their largest walled city. So as we think about our areas of stuckness and the breakthrough you care for Hezekiah, like this was a moment of holy discontent. Right? He saw the way the people of Judah were worshiping false gods, living in open sin, and God broke something in him. He saw the disconnect between God's command and the lifestyle of the people, and he knew something had to change. So as Hezekiah ascended to the throne, he got to work on pursuing transformation, right? He got rid of the shrines. He smashed the pillars and broke the poles. He took back the land the people had lost to their enemies, the Philistines. And what we see in another book that talks about the kings of Judah and Israel, 2 Chronicles, it says that Hezekiah unlocked the temple doors. It had been locked under his father. He unlocked it. He refurbished it. He instituted proper sacrifices and holy days. Like, he's essentially cleaning house. And we see here the writer in 2 Kings is proclaiming that Hezekiah was successful in everything he did. Like, things are going well. The people of Judah are free from their enemies. They're again seeking to honor the Lord. The breakthrough that Hezekiah pursued, it seems certain, yet as we're going to see, things were about to change. So let's jump down to 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 13. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, King Sennacherib of Assyria came to attack the fortified towns of Judah and conquered them. King Hezekiah sent this message to the king of Assyria at Lachish. I have done wrong. I'll pay whatever tribute money you demand, if only you will withdraw. The king of Assyria then demanded a settlement of more than 11 tons of silver and 1 ton of gold. To gather this amount, King Hezekiah used all the silver stored in the temple of the Lord and in the palace treasury. Hezekiah even stripped the gold from the doors of the Lord's temple and from the doorposts that he had overlaid with gold, and he gave it all to the king of Assyria. So the story of Hezekiah now jumps ahead 14 years into his reign as king, and things are established, right? He's leading the people of Judah into following the Lord, yet this obstacle appeared to stop that progress. The Assyrian king Sennacherib. And what we skipped over is in this story is the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. You see, God raised up this Assyrian army and this king Sennacherib to overrun the Israelites, right, the northern kingdom, and sent them into exile. And now he has his sights set on Judah. And so how did Hezekiah choose to respond to this major obstacle to breakthrough that just showed up? It says, well, what did he try to do? He tried to pay the Assyrians to go away, right? He stripped the temple that he worked so hard to restore, and he emptied the treasures of all the valuables attributed to the Lord. He emptied out the coffers of the royal palace. Like, he emptied it all out in efforts to bring about breakthrough, right? Essentially trying to bring about change by their own means. As we looked at last week in Abraham's story, right, on the journey to breakthrough faith, we have to be stripped of our expectations of how we believe our breakthrough should be. Why? Because God is focused on our hearts and his mission in pursuit of breakthrough. You see, there's so much that God longs to do in Hezekiah and the people of Judah through this enemy king, Sennacherib. So let's keep reading and see how this attempt at buying a breakthrough, how to sort of pursue their own way of bringing about breakthrough. Let's see how that worked out. As you probably can guess, not very well. So we'll pick up in 2 Kings 18, verse 17. Nevertheless, never a good word there, the king of Assyria sent his commander-in-chief, his field commander, and his chief of staff from Lachish with a huge army to confront King Hezekiah in Jerusalem. The Assyrians took up a position beside the aqueduct that feeds water into the upper pool, near the road leading to the field where cloth is washed. So with their resources exhausted and now a powerful army at the doorstep, Hezekiah and the people of Judah are at the end of the rope. They've reached that low point, right, that crisis of faith. And the tunnel that I walked through was chiseled in fears that this scenario might become reality. The people are essentially surrounded by an enemy army, the most powerful in the land, and they have no way out. And to add insult to injury, the Assyrian officials began to mock Hezekiah and the God of Israel. Listen to what they say in 2 Kings 18, verse 22. But perhaps you will say to me, we are trusting in the Lord our God, but isn't he the one who was insulted by Hezekiah? Didn't Hezekiah tear down his shrines and altars and make everyone in Judah and Jerusalem worship only at the altar here in Jerusalem? I'll tell you what, strike a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria. I'll give you 2,000 horses if you can find that many men to ride on them. With your tiny army, how can you think of challenging even the weakest contingent of my master's troops? Even with the help of Egypt's chariots and charioteers. What's more, do you think we have invaded your land without the Lord's direction? The Lord himself told us, attack this land and destroy it. Wow, right? I mean, Hezekiah and the people of Judah, they've reached this crisis of faith. right? They devoted themselves to following the Lord. They were doing the right things, and yet here they find themselves in a dire situation. And when the obstacle presented itself, all of their attempts at breakthrough have fallen short. They are, as that popular saying goes, a day late and a dollar short. And at the lowest point on the journey to breakthrough, the crisis of faith is where we have to decide what we truly believe. As the Assyrians and King Sennacherib proclaimed, was God really on the side of Judah? Or was the truth, as the enemy at the doorstep was saying, that God was working against them, and God was the one who had sent this enemy to destroy them? If we go back to that breakthrough U-curve, you'll see right below the crisis of faith is this circle called the loop of despair. It's a crossroad. It's a choice between two paths. And which path we choose to take will ultimately come down to which voice we choose to listen to. You see, will we hang on to what God has spoken? Will that be the knot we tie on the end of our rope? Or will we choose to listen to outside voices that speak counter to what God said? You see, we have an enemy that has no desire to see us receive breakthrough in our areas of stuckness. As Jesus warned us in the gospel account of John chapter 10, verse 10, that the thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. Mine, meaning Jesus, he says, my purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. When we see God bring about a breakthrough, it lifts our faith. It points others to God's glory. And the last thing the enemy wants is for us to experience breakthrough. So true to his purpose, as Jesus said here, right? The thief longs to steal, kill, and destroy what God has birthed in us. But those outside voices, it may include more than just that inner struggle. It may also be others offering advice with good intentions, right? For Hezekiah and the people of Judah, the Assyrians were trying to speak some common sense into a people that were completely enclosed. They were encircled with no way out. And this reminds me of a movie that came out a few years ago called Breakthrough, ironically, that was based on the true story of a lady named Joyce Smith. When her 14-year-old son, John, fell through an icy Missouri lake one winter morning, she and her family had seemingly lost everything. At the hospital, John lay lifeless for more than 60 minutes. But Joyce was not ready to give up on her son. She was a woman of faith. So she mustered all of her faith and strength into one force and cried out to God in a loud voice to save him. And miraculously, her son's heart immediately started beating again. And in the coming days, John would defy every expert, every case history, and every scientific prediction. 16 days after falling through the ice and being clinically dead for an hour, he walked out of the hospital under his own power, completely healed. I mean, it's an incredible movie and story of breakthrough that includes a major crisis of faith. You see, though her son was technically breathing, Joyce was told repeatedly by different medical experts that her son would never come out of the vegetative coma he was in. And she could have let go of the miracle she was believing God for. But she chose to tie a knot of hope and hang on when she reached the end of her rope. And when we choose to believe the outside voices, we can find ourselves in the loop of despair, believing this is simply the way things ought to be, that our places of stuckness are part of God's will. The people of Judah and Hezekiah could have chosen to respond that way, to get stuck in the loop of despair. That is one path on that crossroad at a crisis of faith, but there's another option: to, in hope, believe what God has spoken. And there's this really amazing image of hope in the New Testament book of Hebrews. It's found in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 19. Let me read this for you. It says, "This hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctuary." You see, hope serves as an anchor for our souls. And what's the purpose of an anchor, right? It's to keep a boat from drifting, especially when there's winds or strong currents, right? Code language for a storm. But notice the writer here says that this hope is an anchor for our souls. What is he talking about here? It's hope in the promises of God. And I don't have time to read all of Hebrews 6, but the writer is pointing us to God's promises that we have in Scripture and how we can rest in Him. In fact, those promises, he says, leads us into His presence. So we can choose to anchor ourselves, to sort of tie the knot of hope in what God has spoken when we reach the end of our rope, and trust that He will keep us secure. We won't fall or drift away. Let's see how Hezekiah chose to respond in this crisis of faith. We'll pick up in 2 Kings now, chapter 19, verse 14. After Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it, he went up to the Lord's temple and spread it out before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed this prayer before the Lord. O Lord, God of Israel, you are enthroned between the mighty cherubim. You alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You alone created the heavens and the earth. Bend down, O Lord, and listen. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see. Listen to Sennacherib's words of defiance against the living God. It is true, Lord, that the kings of Assyria have destroyed all these nations, and they have thrown the gods of these nations into the fire and burned them. But of course the Assyrians could destroy them. They were not gods at all, only idols of wood and stone shaped by human hands. Now, O Lord our God, rescue us from his power. Then all the kingdoms of the earth will know that you alone, O Lord, are God. What a powerful prayer from someone in a desperate situation. What did Hezekiah do, right? He didn't dwell on the taunts of the Assyrians. He brought the situation to the Lord. And I love that he took their words and just spread them out before the Lord, right? Essentially, right, identifying God as the source of the obstacle, like the attack of the obstacle, but also the source of the breakthrough. Hezekiah and the people chose to choose to anchor their souls, their belief in God's promises. And in this prayer we just read, we see some instruction for how we can pray when we face a crisis of faith. And I love these words of Hezekiah's prayer. He starts first, right, with thanksgiving and praise to God. The first thing Hezekiah did was remind himself of who God is, what he has promised, what he has done, right? He's Lord over all. There's nothing he can't do. When we face a crisis of faith on the journey to breakthrough, it's so important that we speak God's truth, his promises over our situation. The next thing we see him do is acknowledge the situation. Right after giving praise to God, Hezekiah shared honestly about the obstacle in their path. The enemy the people of Judah were facing was a powerful force, right? They had conquered many other nations, including the northern kingdom of Israel. When we face a crisis of faith, it's important to bring our request to God, to name the obstacles that stand in the way of breakthrough. I love this quote from Charles Spurgeon. He says this: "The heart of prayer is the prayer of the heart." Right? Come to God with your need. He already knows it. And then the last thing we see here is to invite God's breakthrough. Once Hezekiah acknowledged the reality of the situation, he ended by asking God to break through. I love that Hezekiah reminded himself of God's promises while addressing the obstacle, right? Of course, the Assyrians conquered the other nations because they weren't coming up against the Lord. Those are just idols made of wood and stone. But by praying for God's breakthrough, Hezekiah was releasing his expectations of how the breakthrough should come about, instead choosing to hope with expectancy that God would rescue the people. And of course, that breakthrough, right, he said, would be tied to God's glory. His last words were declaring that if God would work in a miraculous way, that he couldn't help but be the spotlight to the surrounding nations. You see, we can invite God to be God in our places of stuckness. We can choose not to get stuck on that loop of despair, but to anchor our hope in God's promises, to tie a knot of hope and hang on in expectancy. And what's amazing about Hezekiah's story is that God did come through. We don't have time to go into the rest of the story, but the prophet Isaiah, who was active during Hezekiah's reign, received a word from God that brought about a revived hope. His message for the people of Judah was that the Assyrians that you see today will not enter the city. God would send them back by the same road they came. And this chapter 19, ends with this miraculous breakthrough moment. Listen to this in 2 Kings 19, verses 35 and 36. That night, the angel of the Lord went out to the Assyrian camp and killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. When the surviving Assyrians woke up the next morning, they found corpses everywhere. Then King Sennacherib of Assyria broke camp and returned to his own land. He went home to his capital of Nineveh and stayed there, like he stayed away. God broke through without an arrow shot or a shield raised. He worked in a way that the people of Judah and the enemy Assyrian army could not see coming. And that same God is at work in our places of stuckness. When God invites us to pursue a breakthrough, he will see it through. It may not come in the way we expect or on our timeline. In fact, it will likely stretch us beyond what we're comfortable with. But God's breakthrough is always about our heart and his mission. As Hezekiah prayed, so that the kingdoms would know that the Lord is God. So if you find yourself in a crisis of faith, if you've come to the end of your rope, the thing I want to just really submit with you today is don't let go. Don't allow the voices around you to drown out what God has promised. Instead, tie a knot of hope and expectancy and choose to hang on. Anchor yourself on that which is secure and trust that we serve the God of breakthroughs. If I could wrap up this message with a few next steps, the first would be become a follower of Jesus. God's greatest promise and the foundation of our hope is that Jesus has made a way for us to be part of God's family. He's the one who served as the bridge, the way for us to come into God's presence, as we read in Hebrews 6. When we face a crisis of faith, sometimes all we can do is hope in Jesus. And if you've yet to place your faith and your trust in him, to hope in the spiritual breakthrough that he has provided by his death on the cross and resurrection, would you let someone in your home church know? We'd love to pray for you and help you take next steps in what it means to follow Jesus. The second next step is this: pray like Hezekiah. I believe the written prayers we have in the Bible are there on purpose. And I hope reading such a raw and real prayer like we have from Hezekiah, it brings a new understanding to how we can bring our areas of stuckness to God. Right? He wasn't afraid to lay it all out there, literally. He laid that threatening scroll from the Assyrians before God. He invited him to show up in the situation. The prayer began and ended with praise, and he also wasn't afraid to acknowledge the reality of the situation. Maybe you've been afraid to be honest with God. Listen, he already knows. I challenge you to begin praying for God to move in your places of stuckness. And the last next step is this: choose to hope. As we looked at throughout this message, maybe the only next step for you today is to choose hope over despair. You see, it's so easy to allow the voices around us to drown out what God has placed in us. The enemy is a thief, and others can speak logically about our situation, but only God can be the one to give the promise and to see the breakthrough through. So allow God's promises to be an anchor for your soul. When you've reached the end of your rope, you're not too far for God to reach. Tie a knot of hope, hold on to what he has promised, and wait in expectancy for the God of breakthroughs to show up. Have a great week, and God bless Oasis.